Before we begin, this is not a video about politics or strategy. This is a video about what it feels like to carry 80 pounds across 56 miles of peat bog and stone in sub-Antarctic winter and arrive at the other end ready to fight. To the men of 3 Para and 45 Commando Royal Marines who made that march in May 1982, and especially to the 18 paratroopers who did not come home from Mount Longdon, this is the Falklands Yomp. The Falkland Islands are not a place designed for human movement. The islands sit in the South Atlantic, 400 miles east of Argentina, roughly the same latitude south as London is north. That is where the resemblance to anywhere familiar ends. The terrain is peat bog and quartzite and tussock grass and wind. The wind is not occasional. It is constant from the west, and in May it carries sleet and sometimes snow, and always cold. And there is no tree on the entire island to break it because nothing tall enough to break the wind can survive it. In May 1982, 2 British units, 3rd Battalion, Parachute Regiment, and 45 Commando Royal Marines, were put ashore at San Carlos Water on the western coast of East Falkland. Stanley, the capital, the objective, was on the eastern coast. Between San Carlos and Stanley was approximately 56 miles of that terrain, measured in a straight line, which no one was walking in a straight line. There were no roads that went where they needed to go. There were no vehicles to spare. There was no time to wait. They picked up their burgans and started walking. First, the wait, because everything about what follows only makes sense if you understand what these men were carrying. A British paratrooper or Royal Marine in the Falklands carried a burgan, a large frame rucksack, packed with everything needed to survive and fight in sub-Antarctic conditions. Inside the burgan, a sleeping bag rated for Arctic temperatures, a waterproof bivy bag, spare clothing, rations for several days, water, a gas cooker and mess tin, spare ammunition beyond what was on the body, and whatever specialist equipment the soldier's role required, extra radio batteries, mortar rounds distributed among the section, anti-tank missiles broken down and shared out. On the body, in webbing pouches and a belt kit, went the immediate fighting load, ammunition magazines, grenades, field dressings, water bottle, personal weapon. The personal weapon for most was the SLR, the self-loading rifle, a full-sized battle rifle that weighs 10 pounds unloaded. Weigh it all together and the figure comes out somewhere between 80 and 120 pounds, depending on the man's role and what the company commander had decided to push forward on this particular march. The soldiers who were carrying sections of the battalion's Milan anti-tank missiles were at the higher end. Everyone was well above 80. An average man weighs about 160 pounds. These soldiers were moving across broken ground carrying more than half their own body weight. The peat comes first. The Falklands are essentially one continuous peat bog, interrupted by ridges of quartzite. The peat is formed from thousands of years of compressed dead vegetation, and it holds water the way a sponge holds water. Completely, permanently, and at a temperature only marginally above freezing. In May, in the rain, the surface of the peat looks solid. It has a crust of dead grass and matted vegetation that will, for a moment, hold a man's weight. Then it doesn't. Private Mark Isles Thomas of 3 Para described the peat in an account written after the war. He said the first time his leg went through the crust to the knee, he thought he had found a bad patch. Then it happened again. Then he understood that this was simply what the ground was. You walked on it, and occasionally, you fell through it, and you pulled your leg out and kept walking. With 80 pounds on your back, pulling your leg out of knee-deep peat requires the use of both hands, the other leg braced, and a significant expenditure of energy that you needed for the next mile and the mile after that. The suction of wet peat on a boot is a specific and remarkable force. Men lost their boots in it. The laces would hold, but the peat would not release the boot itself, and the leg would come up and the foot would come out of the boot, and then the boot had to be recovered from the hole by hand. This happened to multiple men on multiple occasions. The columns moved at night or in the gray half-light of sub-Antarctic autumn mornings, navigating by compass bearings across ground with no distinguishing features. And the men at the front broke through the crust most often because they were the first to cross each section of ground. The men behind them stepped into the holes left by the men in front, which was in some ways easier and in some ways worse because the holes were already filled with water. The stone runs were the other obstacle. The quartzite ridges that cross East Falkland have, over thousands of years of freeze-thaw cycles, shed their rock in a particular way. The boulders roll downhill slowly and accumulate in long rivers of loose stone, sometimes hundreds of meters wide, running down the valleys between the ridges. From a distance, they look like a gray beach, sitting incongruously in the middle of the landscape. Up close, they are a field of rounded quartzite boulders, each one coated in black and orange lichen, that is, in the wet, essentially frictionless. The boulders range from the size of a football to the size of a car. They are not fixed. They shift when weight is applied. The gaps between them go down 2 or 3 feet and sometimes more, and the gap is wide enough to swallow a leg to the hip if the wrong stone moves at the wrong moment. Crossing a stone run in daylight without a load, wearing good boots, takes concentration and care. Crossing one in the dark, or in sleet, or both, carrying 80-plus pounds on a body that has already been walking for 6 hours, is a different category of experience. Men fell, men twisted ankles, men put their legs into gaps between boulders, and felt the specific cold fear of a joint moving in a direction. Joints are not designed to move, and then pulled themselves upright and kept going, because the man in front was already 10 meters ahead, and the company was moving, and the war was waiting at the other end. Lieutenant Colonel Hugh Pike, commanding 3 Para, later described the stone runs as the single most exhausting physical feature of the entire march, not because of what they did to the body, though they were brutal, but because of what they did to the mind. You could not establish a rhythm on a stone run. You could not switch off the part of your brain that was calculating each footfall. Over a long march, the ability to move without conscious attention to every step is how men preserve enough mental energy to function at the end of it. The stone runs took that away. The route 3 Para followed went north and east from San Carlos through Douglas Settlement and on to Teal Inlet. From Teal Inlet, the battalion turned south toward the high ground above Stanley. 45 Commando took a similar northern route before swinging east. Both units were trying to reach the mountains that ring Stanley from the west and south, Mount Longdon, Two Sisters, Mount Harriet, where the Argentine defensive positions sat. The march was not a single sustained effort. It happened in stages, with rest periods at farms and settlements along the way, where men could dry their feet and eat hot food and sleep inside rather than in a bivvy on peat. But the rest periods were not long, and the distances between them were, and the pack went back on every time. The feet were a constant problem. Wet feet in boots that stay wet for 8 days produce a condition called immersion foot, a close relative of trench foot, the same affliction that devastated armies in the First World War. The skin softens and begins to break down, and blisters form that are deeper than ordinary blisters, and nerve damage causes numbness that is initially almost a relief, but becomes something to worry about seriously. Men walked on feet they could no longer feel properly, which meant they could no longer tell when the foot was in trouble, until the boot came off and they looked at it. The drill at rest stops was to remove boots, remove wet socks, dry the feet as thoroughly as possible, apply foot powder if any remained, put on the 1 pair of dry socks that had been preserved at the bottom of the Bergen throughout the entire march, and then put the wet boots back on. The dry socks would be wet within 20 minutes of resuming the march. Men did this anyway because 20 minutes of dry socks was 20 minutes less time the skin was in contact with wet cotton. And over 8 days, those 20 minutes compounded into something that made a difference to whether the foot stayed functional. The wind was so consistent that it ceased to register as a condition and became simply a feature of the world. Men leaned into it while walking west and were pushed along while walking east, and it was always there. And it drove the rain horizontally, and on the exposed ridges between the valleys, it cut through every layer of clothing with a persistence that seemed almost purposeful. The cold was not extreme by Arctic standards. Temperatures around 0 to 5 degrees Celsius, falling lower at night. What made it severe was the combination, the wind driving wet air through clothing, the wet boots and wet socks, the wet ground, and the inability to get fully dry at any point across 8 days. Cold in those conditions is not dramatic. It is cumulative. It settles into the body incrementally and takes up permanent residence, and the effort required to keep warm becomes another tax on a body that is already spending everything it has on the walking. Men sang, sometimes. Marines use a particular word for this kind of march. They call it a yomp, a piece of slang whose precise origin no one can pin down, but which contains something of the sound of the thing. The effort, and the rhythm, and the forward motion, regardless of conditions. The paras call the same thing a tab, tactical advance to battle, which is more formally descriptive and somewhat less evocative. Both words, by the end of East Falkland, had acquired a specific weight. When the soldiers who did it used either word afterward, they knew what they were referring to without having to explain. The physical accounting is the part that gets recorded. The mental arithmetic is harder to put down. A man walking in a column has, in theory, nothing to do but walk, one foot in front of the other. Follow the man ahead. Don't fall through the peat. Don't break an ankle on the stone run. In practice, the mind does not accept this simplicity and begins to work against the body in the particular way that exhaustion produces, cycling through the distance remaining, the weight of the burden, the condition of the feet, the time since the last rest, the likelihood of a rest before long, the distance remaining again. This loop, running on insufficient sleep in a body that is spending everything it has on forward motion, becomes its own kind of labor. The men who had done this before, the NCOs with combat experience, the officers who had served through Northern Ireland and trained extensively in the mountains of Wales and Scotland, understood that the loop had to be broken. You broke it by counting, by singing, by fixing attention on the next identifiable landmark, the next ridge, the next farm track, and making that the entire world until it was reached, and then finding the next one. By talking to the man beside you about something entirely unrelated to the march, the cold, the feet, the weight, or the war waiting at the other end. The Marines had a particular technique, or rather, it emerged spontaneously and became a technique, of naming the features of the landscape. The peat bogs got names. The stone runs got names. Informal, obscene, specific names that made the terrain into a known quantity rather than an endless anonymous obstruction. Once a stone run had a name, it was a thing that had an end. You were not crossing an infinite field of wet quartzite. You were crossing the one that would be behind you in 20 minutes if you kept moving. 20 minutes. Then the next one. On the morning of June 11th, 3 Para was on the slopes below Mount Longdon. 45 Commando was below Two Sisters. The march was over. What followed was a night battle, fought in the dark on a rocky ridge that would cost 3 Para 18 men killed before the mountain was taken. The Yomp itself had cost no men. That is the remarkable thing. The distances, the weight, the terrain, the weather, the feet, none of it had reduced the fighting strength of either unit to the point where the night assaults couldn't be mounted. The men who went onto Mount Longdon on the night of June 11th were not fresh. There is no mechanism by which you become fresh after 8 days of that. But they were effective, and they were there, and they went up the mountain and took it. Private Isles Thomas was on Longdon that night. He had been through the peat and the stone runs and the wet socks and the wind. He was 19 years old. He said years later that the thing he remembered most clearly about the march was not the exhaustion or the weight or the cold. He said he remembered the silence on the stone runs at night, the way sound disappeared on them, the wind going somewhere else, the peat no longer making noise underfoot, just the clatter of boots on quartzite in the dark and the breathing of the men around him and the grinding of the stone. He said it was the strangest silence he had ever heard. Then the stone run ended and the peat started again and the wind came back and they kept walking,